Hey, Andrea. Good. Yourself?
Good to see you after so many chats on LinkedIn.
All good. Hello, everyone, if they can see me.
We
Pat.
can.
Hi, Pat. How are
Hey,
you?
how you going? Good, good. Hi, Craig.
Howdy.
Yeah. Where are you calling from?
I'm calling in from Brisbane.
Fantastic. I'm all the way on the west coast in Perth.
Aha, good to have you.
Cool. Explains the sunshine.
Yeah, 3 o'clock in the afternoon. Fantastic.
Wow, the sun is always shining in Perth as far as I'm concerned. Like,
Oh, best part of the country. You're missing out.
beautiful. Such a gorgeous place. Hi, David. How are you going?
Oh, me? I'm good.
Oh, sorry, different David.
The other one, Parker.
Hi, David Parker. How are you, sir?
I'm well, thank you, Andrea. You're looking well.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah,
Yeah.
you know, this is my lounge room here. I'm back from work, so yeah, no, I think we should have a really good hour session here. Listen, people will start to drop in, you know, progressively over time, but I'll just start to kick off, I think. One thing I can also do is actually share my screen. So you can see, like, if you guys scroll down to sort of the bottom of your Zoom window, you can see something called chat, and you can actually kind of post questions, or you can do whatever you like, really, in that chat area. So if you want to ask a question, I'll always have that open, just as I, you know, commence my little webinar here. But also, if you want to just drop in like a sentence to introduce yourself, I thought that might be a good way to kind of capture it in text as well, so we can kind of you know, keep that for posterity without losing any time while we're actually going through. Again, I'm not sure exactly how many people are going to show up to this, but if we kind of keep doing the introductions round and around, we'll probably be here for an hour just doing that. Hi, Eleanor, how are you? Putting out audio. All right, Eleanor will come in a second. Okay, so what I think I'll do is I'll just get into it. I've got a bit of a structure here around what we can cover in this hour. The session is designed to be as interactive as we can. You know, I really want to hear questions and have a discussion as a community who obviously realise that international talent are slightly important, especially for a country like Australia, and you know, that it's really a vital part of our future. I'm also recording this session, so we did have a few people who are at a few events this evening. The 100 Women of Influence event is on tonight, who have sort of begged and pleaded that we record the session so that they can watch it back at a later date. So if that's not okay with you, maybe you know, if you want to, you know, drop out and then you can watch it at a later date. Otherwise, we'll all be being recorded on this. So, you know, no diplomatic incidents. Okie dokie. So let me get.
I'm glad I had a haircut.
Yeah, that's right. I know. I've got lipstick on and everything. All right. Okay. So I'm going to share my screen now and just do this little presentation as we go. Here we are. Okay, can you guys see my screen? You should see some sort of yellow circles there. Yes, no? Can you see that?
Ah, yes.
Yeah? Okay.
Oh, wow. What's that?
Whoa! It's well, this is what you call a template that you just quickly bash some stuff into, and it looks very fancy. So,
Right. Okay.
but let's go through. So, we'll probably have a few notifications. But that's all right. Okay. What's that background noise?
It's probably someone calling from mum.
Oh, yeah, okay. I couldn't quite make out what it was saying, but anyway, someone, if it's something that is really important, just someone repeat the message. If it's something just random, don't worry about it. Okay, so obviously I think accelerating international talent is it's a no-brainer, probably to everyone on this call. Like, why on earth wouldn't you want to connect to the world and have people that can connect to the world when we're living in a globalized world? Like, you know, what the hell? But at least here in Australia, we do notice that there can be a little bit of a disconnect, or just a lack of understanding. If you've lived in one economy for your whole life, you might not have the lived experience of understanding why perspectives from outside, you know, intel from outside, or access to networks from outside might be super important to bring into the business. So this is the sort of rough sort of outline of what we're going to do. We've got 53 minutes. The introductions take place in the chat on the side, so make sure that you do put in a sentence about yourself on the side there, so that we know who each other is, and if we want to, we can follow up at a later date and say hi, or connect back on LinkedIn and so on. What I'll do after this is I'll post this webinar up on LinkedIn as well, or at least a link to it, so that people can access it, and I'll link everybody here, because I basically know or have connected with you through LinkedIn. So I'll do a little, you know, just a little mini post to say thanks everybody for joining, and here are the different people who are obviously legends for giving up an hour of their time on a rainy, Wednesday? Okay, so there's basically two questions that we're going to be tackling. So what benefits do international talents bring? I'll just be kind of teasing that out into how it is that we recognize talent, and how it is that we articulate our own value when it comes to talking about bringing in an international skill set into your business. And then, you know, a discussion I don't think is you know, it doesn't really kind of hit, you know, the rubber doesn't hit the road until you discuss what happens when everything goes wrong. And you come across roadblocks and people still aren't getting it, and you're like, what the hell? So we've also had a great deal of questions come in, and I'll show you those in just a second, from people saying, well, I'd love it if we could discuss this or that. And we'll take a look at those in a second. Hopefully we'll be able to kind of cover off on most of them. If not, then we can always bookmark things and do a follow-up session, or, you know, or whatever. But overall objective is to really have a discussion. I've just given us some sort of broad frameworks in which to be able to do that. So please don't feel like you have to kind of, you know, sit as an audience member. Like, by all means interrupt, you know, offer a tip that you might have, something that you might have learned, and so on and so on. Most certainly not the font of all wisdom on anything, really, but particularly this stuff, it's so diverse. Okay, so now moving forward. So this is a whole bunch of questions that came in when I kind of put the call out to say, you know, let's have a discussion around how we recognize talent in an international age. There's a whole bunch of stuff in here, but I thought the top one was quite interesting. How can professionals going into international ecosystems feel like their skills and talents are legitimate and can be helpful? I'll go into how I kind of dissect that in a subsequent slide. But does anyone have any, you know, any sort of tips or hints, or, you know, an experience that they can relate perhaps when it comes to the question, how can professionals going into international ecosystems feel like their skills and talents are legitimate and can be helpful?
I guess a good starting point is what exactly are international ecosystems?
Yeah, I would guess, obviously it's not my question, but I would guess that they're talking about, you know, if you're going into a different context to your own home culture and, you know, your own nationality. So, you know, if you're going into a new city, I'm just going to go with, you know, Beijing, because I know it so well. It's not just a city, it's a system of different, you know, legalities, talent networks, business networks, and so on and so on. So I guess their question is, how do you plug into a complex system and still feel like what you're bringing to the table is legitimate and or even helpful?
Okay, Andrea, I'd like to venture a comment there, and this is by no means, the definitive definition of how it should be done. This is only my experience, and I can only talk from that.
Yep.
I've been in the sort of role that I've done for more than 25 years.
Yep.
I've traveled around the Asia Pacific region pretty extensively doing business development work across multiple industries, China included.
Yep.
And the one thing that I find really useful in working across so many different cultures, and we all know that, it's not the same. Even within China, there are different subtleties, going from province to province.
Yeah.
And the one thing that I find really useful is that you tend to pick things up really quickly, and you tend to be able to read people very quickly and build trust very quickly. And I've certainly found that to be a very useful skill to have when it comes to, doing business across cultural boundaries, not just national boundaries, but cultural boundaries. And I think this is a skill that not many Australian companies actually understand. And I think because of that lack of understanding, they're not quite sure how to use it. It's only people like us who've been out there in the field, who've actually lived through the experience, know it. So that's what I think. That people like us actually have a lot of experience and talent, and we bring that to the table. And I think it's actually to Australia's disadvantage that we don't take more. We don't take people like ourselves seriously when we have these skills out there. That can actually be used very, very usefully to penetrate these markets. And like you said before, it's something that really grinds my cookies when there's all this talent out there and it's just being wasted.
Yeah, it grinds my cookies. That's definitely going to be part of my new brand, making a t-shirt. Yeah, no, it does. And particularly in a really successful multicultural society that Australia has, I think there's been a little bit of a tendency to view multiculturalism as, in the kind of like festivals, flags and floats, kind of box, without necessarily, and then food, of course, but without necessarily being able to view that as like a massive economic strength of this nation. And, if we can just unlock ways where we don't overlook that talent and where that talent has the kind of confidence to be able to front up to, their boss or their boss's boss, and say, listen, there's a business case here and I think I'm the person to do it. And these are the team I'd like to work for or work with, and so on. Like, I really agree with you that we could, within 12 months, I think we could see a pretty significant change. But it does require, the kind of the powers that be to, I don't know, think about things in a different way. And I think that's where the roadblock is.
Definitely.
I think, just to be a little more controversial, Andrea, I think the isolation is the impact. Australia is isolated. We're isolated, have to be self-sufficient, and we subsequently think that we have to be self-sufficient. And to go outside for skills and to value experience gained outside doesn't really have any significance. If we go back to how this all started, it was your comment about your own experience of your China experience not being valued when you came to Australia.
Yeah.
You're lucky that people actually knew where China was.
Right.
Yeah, and it's not something that's valued or has ever really been valued here. And it's because of our geography.
Yeah.
Unlike Asia, unlike Europe, we don't have next door neighbours that pop across to visit.
We've got Tasmania.
Yeah, got Tasmania and New Zealand, perhaps.
Yeah.
But there's no cultural influences.
Right.
So consequently, we've never had to learn to live with other cultures, and we don't value the benefit of doing that.
Mm.
And
Yeah.
I think that's one of the issues. I don't think there's any issues with Australian companies recruiting talent from overseas, because they do it all the time.
Mm-hmm.
But that's what started this discussion, was more the impact or the challenge facing Australians who come back to Australia with international experience that isn't valued.
Yeah.
And I don't know the answer, but that's gets back to our heritage and our isolation and our independent attitude. You know, we can do it. I don't know how you overcome it, and hopefully there'll be some people on this conversation that have some views on how better you can use and take advantage of that experience.
Yeah. Yeah. 100%. I mean, I think there's sort of several different segments to this, isn't there? Like, you know, when I go over to China and work, it's very obvious that I'm international. You know, I couldn't fool anybody that, you know, I'm from Beijing or anything. But you know, it's very. I've tried, trust me. But you know, it's a really different thing for when, say, an Australian-born Chinese heads over to China and is needing to articulate an international skill set. Yet, you know, often the perception from Chinese people in China will be, well, you know, but aren't you Chinese? Like, you know, how international are you? And, you know, if you're sort of falling in that middle space where, you know, you might not be perceived as being Chinese or international, you know, it's a different thing, you know, just sort of making it clear that from my perspective is, you know, I don't blend in China, and I blend in completely in Australia, and that will be very different for people who have, you know, different identities and different backgrounds and so on and so on. So when we kind of, you know, when I go through the little sort of tips and tricks that I've prepared, I've tried to be as inclusive as possible, you know, and as sort of, you know, as broad as I can, to say this will work for somebody who is not born in Australia, is from a different culture or heritage, and is making a case to an Australian company or an Australian employer here. But also for Australians who are heading off overseas and thinking, well, you know, what do I have to offer? You know, if I head into a big old city like Shanghai, which has the same population as Australia, you know, how am I actually going to be able to articulate any kind of value there? Yeah, okay, cool. Are there any other questions? I'll just sort of pause here that we might want to add to the pile. You know, we've got a few different ones sort of hanging out on this page here. But is there anything else that anyone's feeling like, oh, I'd really like to throw this into the ring now that, you know, I'm on the call and you know, we're here discussing it?
Yeah, Andrea, it's Craig here. I just wanted to add that, as opposed to those earlier comments about, you know, those cultural differences, I'm really keen on your experience from perhaps the mistakes that you've seen other foreigners make when they're doing business in Australia and vice versa coming back to Australia. You know, what are some of those, I suppose, glaring mistakes that, you know, from your experience, you've seen are mistakes, but those people may not necessarily have realized, like, for example, when it comes to building trust, you know, how we negotiate, how we build a rapport with other people, and the assumptions that we make from, let's say, an Australian perspective, and how that's actually been received from an Asian or from a Chinese perspective.
Yeah, sure. So my experience being a you know, visibly on brand Australian, you know, being Anglo, in China is that you're generally perceived as being less of a pain in the butt than someone from the US. There's, you know, you're seen as being more easygoing, and perhaps having a slightly smaller ego, and expecting things to go in the way that you expect. But the mistakes that I see people make, and like, trust me, I've made them all. Well, I don't know, I've made a couple. Is I think Australia, to sort of speak to that that notion you were talking about, David, the island mentality that we have, that we've had to be self-sufficient supposedly, and that we kind of rely on our own four walls and all that jazz. I think sometimes we think we're a bit bigger player in the Asia Pacific than we actually are. Certainly when a lot of our CEOs, for example, who are sitting in our big companies, when they really kind of came into their own in their careers, let's say in the 90s, China's economy was a quarter of the size. And I've definitely seen CEOs from our large financial institutions speak to CEOs from some of China's biggest banks, which are some of the biggest banks in the world, and our financial institutions simply are not, and speak to them as in, well, what can we do for you? Like, how can we help you out, little Chinese bank? And that sort of terminology, like that sort of, like, it's just cringeworthy. You're like, dude, like, do you realize, like, can you get your own sense of superiority when it comes to speaking with people who aren't of your culture? Like, they've just got it in their head that China is so much further behind than it actually is. And it's difficult to sort of reframe that or rewire that unless you really dig deep and challenge some of your most deeply held assumptions that you might have had since childhood, for example. So I've definitely seen a bit of an inflation of the old Australian ego. I think the most skillful people internationally are the ones that listen more than they talk. I don't know if that's just the introvert in me speaking, but I really think that you can gain some amazing intel if you just shut up for a while and let people, come to you and offer what they want to offer to you. But I do see, we even noticed that within the camp teams, like within our innovation teams, where we have 2 Australians and 2 Chinese and building a startup in 100 days, that we had to reframe the whole program in the second year, because we noticed that the Australians tended to want to tell the Chinese how things were. And so we front-ended the program in the second year with the Australians going up to China and actually seeing what's going on for themselves, and not just relying on sort of outdated tropes that come back in our media about how China's going or where it's at. And that helped a lot, just in terms of really understanding, like, what's the relationship like between our 2 countries. And I think if you understand China's economy is 2,000% bigger than ours and growing at 3 times the rate, and that to me is like, the relationship between the 2 countries is like a little bird standing on the back of the rhinoceros, and they have a great relationship together. It's a symbiotic, mutually beneficial relationship, but the bird can't think it's a rhinoceros. It's ridiculous. So that would be the big thing that I that I noticed, that just trickles down into so much. And if you listen more and understand exactly how you're adding value, that's the real deal.
I'm just having a quiet smile there, Andrea, while I was listening to that.
Oh, far out.
It is very true. It is very true what you said about just listening to how people interact. You can actually pick up a lot of cues and a lot of market intelligence. Just listen. Don't presume anything. Don't assume anything. Don't bring I guess, for want of a better word, Western perceptions into how things should be done or ought to be done in China, because it's a very different market. It's the same as wherever we go, and not just in China. If we could step into Indonesia, very different. We could step into Malaysia, different. Philippines, different. Thailand, different. every market has got its funny quirks, and we've got to go in there with an open mind and not make any assumptions as to how, oh, in Australia we do this and this is how it should be done. The number of times, and I keep telling people who want to listen about this, the number of times I've seen deals die before you even get to the quote stage, it's not funny, and it's because of this.
Yeah.
And this is stuff that you can't teach this in MBA classes. You've got to go out there and into the field and actually see this for yourself. It's scary. It really is.
Yeah, it's a really good point, actually. Like, it makes me think about the value that camp actually has. Like, you're right, you can't get that in an MBA class. You can read about it, but you don't feel your heart beating in your chest when someone goes silent.
Yep.
Like, you don't get that visceral understanding, and nor do you get the wins in the classroom when you nail it, and you sort of change your behavior slightly and watch an outcome and see how things are working, and you're like, maybe I didn't just F that up. Like, maybe I actually did quite well there,
Exactly.
It's so true. Okay, cool. All right, so listen, we've only got a little bit over half an hour, so I'm going to start whipping through. But again, let's have a chat. I'm sure we'll get there. Okay, so the first question that we wanted to focus on was, what benefits do international talent bring to Australia? I think there's so many different ways to think about it, but let's just focus on Australia for now. Like, if you've grown up internationally and you're bringing an international talent of yourself in, or if you're born and bred in Australia, you've gone out and then you've come back a changed person, how do you articulate that to your bosses and so on? So let's keep going forward. When I think about this in the most simple way that oh, Craig, would you mind muting your microphone? Yeah?
Oh, sorry.
That's all right. You just sound like you're eating cornflakes.
Yeah. Sorry, I was just moving. Yeah, one moment.
Yeah, no worries at all. Okay, thank you so much. Obviously, unmute yourself at will. No worries. Okay, so when we think about the value that we're bringing, to me, the most kind of critical way to look at this, I call the golden triangle, just, helps me remember. But if you can unlock 3 different areas, I think you'll start to see traction. This is what I've kind of analyzed my own experience, and certainly the experience of working with the 300 graduates from camp now, who do start to either become exporters and work in an international field, or they're actually able to kind of skill up themselves, and they actually start to change their behavior, whether it's becoming an innovator, an exporter, or an entrepreneur themselves. So if you have each of these 3 things, I think, in kind of equal balance, then you'll start to kick ass, as far as I'm concerned. But if you undersubscribe in any one of them, you'll start to slow down. So let me just kind of quickly whip through. So when we're talking about skills, yes, this can be technical skills, this can be a cultural understanding that you might have, all of those things, whether they are soft skills or hard skills. Soft skills have very hard outcomes, and I do think that we underestimate them quite a bit in Australia. But if you have a really nicely developed skill set, and that you can do what others either can't or they won't, then I think you do start to stand out. So from my own perspective, again, I'm not Chinese. I have to work every day to boost my China skills. It's something that even people in China, have to work every day to boost their own domestic business skills. But specifically for me, I'm not living in China right now, and I'm not a native speaker. So when I say, having the skills to do what others can't or won't, it makes me think about learning Chinese. So, I started learning Chinese when I was 23, right? And, I wasn't like groomed for this from day dot, at all. I didn't go to a fancy school where, they taught languages in any way that was useful. Other people can learn Chinese as well. You know, like you can pick it up. You can at very least pick up a limited amount of conversational Chinese. And if you are able to do that and others won't, not that they can't, it's that they won't, it's not impossible to do, then that definitely puts you ahead. So, you know, if you were interested in doing business in China and you don't have any Chinese language skills whatsoever, at very least pick up some conversational Chinese and you will most certainly stand out in China and also back here. The networks side of things, as you were saying, Patrick, trusted networks, they take a long time to develop, and I think they go up by the stairs and they come down by the elevator. So making sure that you do have a trusted network, and you know, you're not just networking with people because of a purely business only approach. I think, you know, no one likes to be treated like a wallet or a business card. You know, people like to be treated like people. And that's where you develop trust, you know, from person to person, brain to brain, heart to heart, you know, that actually is what makes a difference. It certainly makes a difference in China. So if you are nurturing those networks and making sure that you're heading out to different events or participating in different forums online, or, you know, you name it, there's a lot of different, you know, online and offline ways to make networks. It's something that you do nurture, you know, over time. So it's like a violin, you know, you can't just pick it up once, play it, and then put it away for 3 years and expect it to sound any good when you pick it up again. You know, like it's something that you have to play every day, and, you know, it's really, like, you put the time in and it yields the benefit back to you. So if you've got networks, you've got people that you know, that you can call on, that you trust. If they tell you something, hey, do that, hey, you definitely should not do that, hey, that person's great, this person's awful. You know, if you've got people that around you that you can trust, that you can ask questions of when you don't know the answer, and you can admit that you don't know the answer, that's a massive, massive part of this golden triangle here. Now, if you have worked up your skills and your network, but you lack any confidence to execute, then you're just going to spin your wheels. You're not really going to be able to articulate your value, I think, in your workplace. You really need to be able to identify what boosts your confidence so that you're able to you're able to make decisions that you have confidence in and that you can stand by in order to deploy those skills and networks. And, you know, if you could almost do an audit, you know, of yourself to sort of think about, right, well, so what is my skill set, and what would I rate myself out of 10 on the skills that I do claim to have? How big is my network? How strong is my network? How influential is my network? Maybe I should do this, actually. Put a little, you know, do a little survey together. You can pop out with a metric. So if you're analyzing your skills and you're analyzing your networks and you're analyzing perhaps a few different scenarios that you might be able to get an understanding of, well, actually, you know, I might have a ton of networks and stacks of confidence, but I don't have any skills. And then if you're still wondering why you're not getting far, or that the things that you're doing aren't necessarily successful, you might be able to identify that the skills part might be a bit underdeveloped. Okay, just before I move on from there, does anyone have any comments on this kind of, you know, weird golden triangle that, you know, I always have in my head, like, you know, kind of develop this out equilibrium?
Only comment, David Parker, only comment, Andrea, probably is that triangle applies whether you're in Australia or in China or in the UK or whatever. They're very sensible and quite key guidelines for someone in their career.
Yeah.
I guess the challenge is bringing that back to mean something in regard to international experience.
Mm.
And that's really what we're focusing on, isn't it? Is how do you use your international experience as the background to this triangle?
Yeah.
Because the issue is that from an Australian point of view, the experience you went through, coming from China back to Australia, your networks didn't really matter. They weren't valued.
Yep.
The skills that you brought back in terms of cultural awareness and commercial understanding of China wasn't valued either.
Yep.
But you did have the confidence. But that's in itself isn't enough to get you over the line, is it? Which is why you ultimately established CAMP.
Yeah. Yeah, it is. I mean, for me, I kind of go into this a little bit in the roadblocks part, and maybe I'll leave a couple of comments to that. But if I take my own experience, yeah, I had a really good skill set, and I did have some great networks. Probably, I mean, you know, they're better now, but your network always gets better, doesn't it? But I reckon I didn't have the confidence, or I didn't understand exactly how to make a business case to my employer, to be able to say, listen, you've got this gap. These are pain points, clearly, you know, it's listed in your strategy. You know, you've got these metrics where you want to achieve them. Here's my business case to be able to say, you know, I think that we can go and do it in this way. And what I'd love is an opportunity to come and pitch to you, to say how we could actually go and nail this together. Like, I didn't have the skill set to be able to do that. When I first returned from China, which was in 2008, you know, like I'm not a not confident person, but I didn't have the confidence within my company, you know, to know how it is that I'm going to actually articulate that. So I think it's much about the skills, networks, and confidence that you have developed internationally, but then deploying them by understanding what's happening locally as well. You know, if you're international and you don't have a local network, you know, that networks piece also really, you know, really does make a difference to, you know, to be able to find companies or find peers, you know, that can kind of help you along that journey, I guess.
I think everyone's gone for dinner. Yeah.
No, just listening.
It's fine. Anyone else? I know we've got some people on mute. Any other questions or comments? Comments are also fine before we move on. Okay, all right. Now let's keep going. Okay, so I've got some tips here about how to play the outside game. So, you know, depending on your skill set, certainly being skilled internationally, or coming from an international place and coming into a different network, you kind of are playing the outside game anyway. When I take a look at you know, any given business environment, I take a look at who's winning, you know, who's at the front, and to me that tells me who this game is built to preference. So if I have a look at the ASX 100 boards, for example, I know that it is very much skewed towards old white guys who went to private school. They are the ones that are going to win that game. Now, it doesn't mean that I couldn't win that game, but it does mean that I'm operating at several handicaps if I were to play the game in the exact same way that they have. So that's, you know, one reason why I think, you know, philosophies like lean in, you know, Sheryl Sandberg's advice to professional women that we just need to lean in and play that game. I think is slightly nonsense, or at least very, very hard work. You know, if you're playing to win a game where you are, you know, if you're playing to run a marathon and you're built like Usain Bolt, it's just a different thing altogether. So the way I have found to stay sane and, you know, to feel productive and, you know, to kind of, you know, outstrip everybody is to play the outside game, or what I call the outside game. And that means, you know, when they zig, you zag. I did this when I was working up my China skill set. I mean, I guess having a China skill set in Australia is, you know, zigging when everybody else is zagging anyway. But even within the people that were in my peer group generally, who were heading over to China and, you know, trying to do well, I could see that there were already sort of a, I don't know, you know, a group of people that were quite cliquish. You know, they'd all been to uni together. They all stayed in the same college on campus together. They were all way more wealthy, from way more wealthy backgrounds than I was, and so on and so on and so on. And I just thought, to be blunt, fuck this. Like, I'm not interested in playing that game. I'm not interested in getting that sort of kudos, because it would be fake. It would just be literally fake. Like, and I wouldn't even know how, and it would be so disingenuous that, you know, it just wasn't going to work. So I took myself off to Western China, where it was far less likely to see people who were playing a more conventional business game. And I decided to pick up a skill set which was really unusual. So, which was tapping into provinces where the growth rates are still above 10%, where, you know, there is a lot of cultural diversity and people might not necessarily be aware of how to negotiate that, or, you know, navigate that, or hit big goals in that, or not be kicked out of the country. Like, you know, there was a lot of kind of different skills that I was picking up by zigging when everybody else seemed to be zagging. And I also thought, it's just crowded. Like, you know, it is, like, in the crowd, it is crowded by definition, and it's really, really difficult to stand out. But, you know, if you're being a little bit of a misfit, you know, that's hanging out and picking up different skill sets. And, you know, I always kind of think of Indiana Jones in a way, you know, like, he's the one that's going off and, you know, actually having those adventures and nearly getting killed, of course, but there's something unique about him, you know? And I thought that that's going to work for me. That's something where I have the temperament to be able to play the outside game in an extended way, love it while I'm doing it, genuinely fascinated by the subject matter that I'm engaging with. And I think, you know, it's a similar thing. This is it's helpful when we think about international skill sets. If you are coming back to Australia and trying to play the same game that everybody else has who has never left Australia, then you're going to be at a disadvantage. You know, if you have a look at the partners of the consulting firms, you know, and if they don't have international experience and they're the ones that are crossing the finish line first, you know, in your particular industry, then, you know, perhaps thinking in a different way about how you might get there might see you get there faster, and, you know, in a way that's way more competitive than trying to play the game that everybody else is playing. Okay, tip 2. In order to do that, you have to understand the crowd, though. So it's not just good enough to be Indiana Jones out there, you know, in the cave of snakes and whatever, and then having no clue what your competitive environment is actually like. You really, really do have to understand this is where everybody else is going, and this is the reason why. You can't just write it off wholesale, which I definitely have in the past. I'm like, yeah, I'm just not going to make money out of China. Like, you know, I'm just not going to approach it that way. I'm going to look at it in terms of adding value or having impact or whatever. But you do have to understand, I think, what the crowd is doing and why it is they're doing it, in order to understand how you might make calculated steps outside of that. So in that way, you can stay a few steps ahead, you know, because the crowd is actually doing this, and crowds tend to move quite slowly. But if you're playing that sort of nimble and agile game where you're kind of comfortable being the outsider in terms of the value that you can add, then I think, you know, you end up being quite good. And if you understand the crowd and you know the crowd, chances are the crowd is part of your network as well. And sometimes you do need to tap back into people that are playing a slightly different game to you, and utilize that as part of your network as well. It's not simply about just severing ties and going rogue and, you know, thinking that, you know, you're going to be Mark Zuckerberg and, you know, screw everybody else. You really do have to temper your own disruptive career steps with really understanding what the rest of the world is doing. And then you can monetize what you know and they don't. Okay, tip 3, stand for something. So if you are going to make the endeavor to stand out and not be part of the crowd, you've got to stand for something. You've got to have people know you for a particular thing, so that when they need to call on that thing, they only think of you. So, you know, I've played around with this little China Geek tag on my LinkedIn, mainly because I don't know how else to capture my really broad interests in China. So China Geek just kind of, you know, it's specific and broad at the same time. But people know me for China. You know, it's quite sort of simple. Oh, you know, you need to go speak to that China girl, Andrea. You know, she can help you out, or she can connect you, and it works. You know, keeping it super simple. You know, so whether it's, you know, I'm the person that's going to connect you to AI. You know, I'm the person that I'm your driverless car person. Whenever you think of driverless cars, you've got to think of me. You know, like, find the thing that actually really sets you apart when you are playing that outside game, and own it like crazy. You don't have to be an idiot about it, but, you know, you have to be quite repetitive and on brand. I'm trying not to say the words personal brand, but you do need to be quite consistent in what it is that you want to become known for. You know, I think a lot of the big CEOs are kind of gunning that way. When you think of Elon Musk, you think of a certain thing. You think of Steve Jobs, you think of certain things, Zuckerberg, and so on. You know, they're just the go-to person for that, and that's something that you can start, you know, straight away, I think. Okay, all right. So I'm going to keep kicking through. So what do we do when things suck? And things absolutely, you know, can become a complete cropper. You know, often when, you know, you can feel incredibly bloody frustrated when you know that there is data to back up the skills and the abilities that you can bring into a workplace, and yet it's just not working. These are some thoughts that I have around how we can actually unstick those things. Okay, so roadblocks. When my boss doesn't understand my value. Probably all of us have had some sort of experience where you're like, right, my boss thinks I'm good at X, but actually I have a master's degree in Y, and I don't know why they're not seeing that from me, or so on and so on. My first tip is explain it to them, and you might have to do it several times. You might have to work on that relationship, you know, and kind of drop it in over the course of time. Bosses aren't mind readers. I'm realizing that more and more the longer I spend as a boss, is that sometimes it can be really difficult for people to come up to you and tell you what it is that's on their mind, particularly when it comes to their own value. But I don't think there's any other way to do it. They're not mind readers. They're not going to spend their time scrolling your LinkedIn and looking at the things that you happen to be posting about. So making it really clear that, hey, you know, I know, you know, I'm working on this particular project, but you know, what you might not remember from that job interview that I did 2 years ago when you hired me is that I actually am extremely proficient in this, and this is a big gap. So please let me help. I think that's a critical point. You've got to explain it in terms of business benefit. Like, what is the business case of doing this? At the end of the day, bosses operate on KPIs, and most of these KPIs are to do with the bottom line. So, you know, if you are able to articulate, right, you know, we seem to be trying to tap into multicultural markets here in Australia, and yet, you know, a lot of that team don't have experience, have lived experience of arriving in Australia and starting to set up, you know, their own life here. But I do, and this part of the team does. You know, maybe we could contribute to that as well. We can add this, this, and this, and so on and so on. So you've really got to be able to kind of tease that out to say, right, I think it's going to have these sorts of benefits, and be very, very, very clear about that. And my third tip is get a new boss. If this stuff doesn't work, then seriously, like, you have to determine how it is that you want to spend your time, and you don't owe anybody any favors, especially if you've done number one and you've done number two, and if it's not happening, then hey, you know, you're not a saint. You can always decide about where you might want to go. And perhaps there's other parts of the company where you might, you know, if you spent time doing, you know, working on your networks and so on, get to know other parts of your company, and get to know when they have an opening or a secondment or what have you, to give you a new boss to try this out on. Okay, next one. What do you do if my company doesn't understand my value? So if you think kind of company-wide, that, you know, they just literally couldn't care. It is most certainly tougher. So I would double check that they actually don't care, and that it's not just your own frustration saying, these fuckers, they're not going to get it, you know, blah, blah, blah. That you are really able to thoroughly check, you know, that this is actually a complete misfit. You know, maybe the company's strategy, you know, we know ANZ, for example, you know, they had a huge push into China, and then they changed strategy, and they pulled out. If that has happened and you went there to get the China skills or the networks or whatever, then hey, you know, maybe it's time to shift focus, and company wide it might not be for you. If you're coming across this and you're kind of looking around going, I don't know where I'm going to go because this whole company seems to not you know, be able to get what I bring to the table, I would find other companies that your value matches their values. Not necessarily what it is that they do, what they execute, but the values of that particular company. So if they value open-mindedness, international perspectives, you know, and so on, they might not be exporting right now, but you might be able to join that company and help them to do what they currently can't do. So finding that kind of value match, this is kind of one of the, I've heard, one of the major reasons why people do leave a company and leave quickly is that when they were hired, they're hired for skill set, but the values didn't match. So there's a lot of, you know, lack of retention happening there. So you might find that you're able to, you know, fit a square peg in a round hole because you've actually not matched for skill set, you've matched for the company's values. You know, lots of people will say that you need to hire for attitude, and aptitude you can train. But it's very difficult to change attitude. And if your company still doesn't understand your value, then just get the hell out. If it's never, ever, ever going to happen, and they, you know, I mean, I would be looking at companies and saying, right, do you have women on your boards? Do you have people from diverse backgrounds on your boards, in your exec teams? And if the answer is no, then I would take my skill set elsewhere. I think we can vote with our money, and we can vote with our time. And I think it's really important to spend your time in places where you can have an amazing impact. When you're doing work that is in line with your value system and how you feel that you're bringing value to the world, like your productivity just goes through the roof. I studied neuroscience as my undergrad, just as an example. I was a pretty average neuroscientist. I just wasn't as interested in it as I am in China. And I had no connection with China back then anyway. But I got literally like 55s, 60s, 65s out of 100 for everything in my neuroscience degree, because I just wasn't doing what I love and what valued what I bring. When I did my degrees in China, I got high distinctions all across the board because it was the right match with what I can bring to the table and what China is. So, if you're feeling frustrated and it's not working, there's only so long you can beat your head up against a brick wall. Sometimes you do have to move out.
I guess just to pick up on that one, and that's actually the sorts of process that you should be going through before you take the job in the first place. And I guess that's the key to the exercise, is do your homework.
Yeah.
And utilise the interview process to your advantage. The interview process is very much a two-sided exercise.
Yes.
Not only do you have to sell your competence, but the person that's interviewing you has to sell their competence as well. Yeah. And that's the best chance to ask all those questions, because it is very debilitating to go through that once you've taken the offer and joined the company. So it's that company doesn't understand my value. You're probably the person that's at fault rather than the company, because that doesn't change overnight, unless, as you say, they change the total corporate focus.
Yeah.
But that can happen. But really, you need to go through that evaluation process right at the beginning.
Yeah, agreed. Absolutely. Okay, I'll just keep whipping through. Here we go. Okay, so what do you do if your industry doesn't value people like you? So to take that big zoom out, like, oh my God, this was what happened to me in neuroscience. I'm like, okay, I'm just not built to work in a small lab with people. I wouldn't do it to them, and I wouldn't do it to me. So what do you do? Again, check those assumptions. Now that I know sort of a bit more about the world, I could see that there would be places for a big picture thinker in the field of neuroscience. But I when I'd been sort of buried at university, just focusing on it was really designed to churn out people that could look at slides of brain tissue and interpret it and go and work in a lab. I had no idea about the possibility of going and working in a research lab in a more anthropological sense, and all of these sorts of things. Like, my assumptions were actually incorrect, and I could probably go back into neuroscience now that I know more about it, and contribute in a way which is more big picture and innovative, and to do with technology, than simply to do with slides. And would the innovative parts of your industry value you? So, maybe the kind of business as usual part is not necessarily built to kind of, capture somebody whose skill set is not, sort of square peg, square hole. But perhaps there's parts of your industry that are looking for different perspectives, that are looking for connection internationally, that are looking for people that can execute in ways which are new to the industry. That might be an interesting thing to look at. Or just simply change industry. Find an industry that you do find, say, the values of really compelling. And, often you find, engineers are needed in places where, which don't result in bridges being built or property being developed or so on. They're looking for people that can manage a project from end to end that is quite technical, and they can bring a different skill set, say, into something in the medical field, and so on and so So I would, again, for me, the kind of research piece around this is often built by going to events. An event is great because you can not only pick up and network, but you can also get some skill, kind of, build some skill value while you're there as well, and at least get a little bit of a taste test about how a particular industry might function. Or you might walk into a room and think, oh geez, I think fintech is so compelling. I really want to go in because I'm really interested in Bitcoin. And then you walk in there and you're like, oh my god, I hate these people. So it might give you a sense. I got nothing against Bitcoin or fintech people, just an example. But it might give you a sense of, actually, these sorts of people might be cool for me to hang around with more. I want to be around these people more and more and more. I wouldn't make a snap decision just based on going to one event and not liking the people, although I have certainly done that in the past. But, I think it really is important if you're uncomfortable and you're not feeling good about how you're being valued at work, is that research is the next step. So, what is the next phase that I might enter into, and just attend a lot of things that are catching your eye, start to attend a few in a particular subject area over time, and you might start to see that there's a correlation between the sorts of things and the sorts of people that you might be gravitating towards.
Excuse me, Andrew, I have a 7:15 commitment, so I have to say good evening.
You bet. No worries.
The rest of the team. Yeah.
Thank you so much, David.
See you, David.
Hi, cheers, El.
All right, terrific. Okay, and David actually runs a recruitment company as well, so he's very, very skilled in this. So I'm going to skip through to two references that I think are really helpful, whether you are from the home culture, like I am. If Australia is perceived as being a white nation, God help us, what was that "it's okay to be white" thing happening this week? So what is that all about? Jesus.
What's going on in Canberra? Can you tell me? Can someone tell me what the hell's going on there?
I think, I don't have a lot of time for political debate. I'm not a political person. I think it's a lot of hot air, but to me it seems like the Emperor's New Clothes have just been discovered. Like, what are these people doing? Like, they're not.
I know.
Not smarter than us. They're not more skilled than us. I always thought that they were. Silly me. But bloody hell, it's a dog's breakfast. Like.
And these are the people. This is part of the discussion here, right? It probably leads into the kind of discussion that we should be having here. These are the people that we've tasked to lead the country into the next century, right? And they talk about this being the Asia Pacific century and all the rest of it. But they're not very clever the way they're running things at the moment. Just listening to some of the rhetoric that's come out from Canberra over the last 2 years, dreadful.
Yeah.
I don't understand how, they could say one thing and then behave, completely opposite to that, and expect everybody to be good about it. How is that even possible?
Yeah.
It's like me saying something to you, Andrea, saying that, I don't like you and blah, blah, blah. And then, oh, by the way, you're good, right? Are you good? You good with everything? Yeah, cool. No worries.
Yeah, and then I'm meant to be just like, oh, okay, well.
Yeah.
Fine. Like, I know it's very weird. Like, if you had told me, I don't know, 10 years ago that we would be quoting, white supremacist slogans, and asking them to be passed in the Senate, and that the government would vote for it, I would be like, okay, cool. So there was a big rally after that, was there? There was people out in the street saying, you've got to be kidding me. Like, that is not the country we've got to live in. But I feel like we're very complacent. Like, we're not as fiery as we used to be or something. Like,
we're very
media to get our aggression out.
Yeah, it's the current vision that's coming out from the government is very low target, seriously low target. We're not aspiring to be better than what we can be. Just today in the media, there was something about the environment minister literally accusing, or rather, being disrespectful to the one of the guys from I think from Fiji, saying that, oh, what are you doing in Canberra? Are you here for the money? It's always about the money, right? And luckily, this fellow was actually very classy. He just said, thanks very much. I'll have a chat with you a bit later. And it turns out Senator Dodson was actually having dinner with him. He was good enough to write a letter to the Environment Minister and copy the Prime Minister and Bill Shorten, saying that really the Environment Minister does owe an apology to this person because he's very well regarded in international circles. And he wasn't here for the money, by the way.
No.
But, there were 4 people seated at the dinner table. They all heard this. And this is from a minister, a federal minister, doing this.
Oh.
And we've had the same sort of embarrassment about China, and this is the biggest trading partner that we have. And we treat them so completely disrespectfully. I can't even imagine how that's even possible. Seriously.
Yeah.
And it makes it hard for business people like us going out there.
Oh, hell yeah. Yeah, it does. I mean, it would be so cool to have a government that was really supportive in the ways where the data is telling us this is how the future is going to look. We have more data than ever. We can make these calculated estimations, and we're investing accordingly. But we don't have that. And so we have to have no other choice but to just get on with it. But, sometimes when politicians seem to be getting it, tripping up so spectacularly.
Big time.
You can't just get on with it. You're like,
yeah.
Guys, I mean, we don't even need you to be good. We just need you to be quiet.
Yeah. And, I did enjoy your analogy earlier when you mentioned that Indiana Jones thing, because it just reminded me about a particular incident probably maybe 4 years ago. I was at a trade seminar in Jakarta. This is for a conference on developing rail infrastructure in ASEAN. And Jakarta has actually got a lot of projects to do with rail infrastructure development and all the rest of it. That's why it was held there. And myself and another colleague, we were lucky enough to be invited to the Australian Embassy, as it were, for an evening, cocktail evening, right? So we were hobnobbing there, and I'm not used to that sort of stuff. I'm more, as you put it, your Indiana Jones type, character.
Yeah.
I go out there, I get my hands dirty, I go into townships, I go into little provinces, I go into little cities. Nobody would go there, and I deal with real people on the ground. I make deals with people like that.
Mm-hmm.
I don't clink champagne glasses with people in embassies and stuff like that. So it was quite an interesting evening to actually see how our tax dollars are actually spent. And definitely there are 2 kinds of skill sets that I saw that night. I mean, you've got expats and certainly their spouses who claim to have a lot of international experience, but their experience to me really extends only to those kinds of soirees, having, nice little gatherings in hotel lobby lounges and things like that, rather than being out there in the field, getting your hands dirty, and certainly being put in some very uncomfortable situations where, maybe your language skills aren't 100%. If they were to actually do those sorts of deals and go on those sorts of trips that I go on and you and I go on, I bet you they'll be completely lost.
Yeah.
So, there's 2 kinds of skill sets that I do see out there. When people say that, they've got international experiences, they need to be drilled into and actually examine, what exactly are you talking about when you mention international business. So, I do enjoy that analogy that you put there. Yeah.
Yeah, I love an Indiana Jones analogy. My next favorite is Ghostbusters. Back to the Future. That's another one.
Yeah.
Okay, so no, I think you're really right, and this is where it makes me so happy that it takes a lot of different types of people to make up a world. I would be the world's worst politician, but there is something to be. There's a skill set to be had in doing that stuff, and it's it's just simply different to my skill set. Where I think that we can add value is by if we are the bridge people and you were in the room with champagne clinkers, or people who clink champagne. Let's not label them too much. But you're the conduit for all the people that you speak to, who are in the field. They don't necessarily get to clink the champagne, but you're the one that can actually, be that bridge and share that, because you actually got into the room. And I feel like that's, kind of finessing our ability. Yeah, sure, we might be bilingual in terms of, Mandarin and English, but we also need to have a bilingual vocabulary where we can speak government and we can speak our own technical whatever it might be.
Correct. Absolutely.
And maybe that's a pretty interesting takeaway from this discussion, where like for so long I had no idea how to speak business. People would talk about key turning, spearheading key turning, unlock solutions or whatever. I'm like, this is nonsense. Garbage. But hey, if you can speak that language, you can land your message. And maybe there's sort of a missing link, perhaps. It's not just about the sort of the raw language, but how is it as bridge people? If we're in this conversation, we're kind of able to do a bit of this. How is it that we're able to identify which side of the vocabulary we might need to work on more? And it might be vocabulary, it might be mannerism, it might be nonverbal cues, it might be, not talking about your dad who lives in a woolly jumper in regional New South Wales. Like it might be whatever,
And definitely the soft skills that you mentioned, they're very, very important. I mean, being able to navigate, I think essentially that's what you're saying, being able to navigate not just between cultures, but also between business and commercial world. That's very different between, say, if you're talking about China. Okay, so you're going to be negotiating deals with people in China, and you're a supplier, you're a manufacturer here in Australia, or maybe the other way around. You've got to be able to straddle both worlds, and be very efficient in that regard, and maybe talk to the suppliers at one end and talk to the end customers at this end, and be able to make sure that you can walk the whole deal through without letting it fall in between. And that is something that a lot of people don't see. And you might be able to write a textbook for an MBA class, but until these guys actually get to go out there and walk a deal themselves and make sure it doesn't fall over, they'll never get it.
Yeah, no, it's true. Sorry about my phone there in the background. Okay, so now let's wrap it up. These two reports are cracking. They're also called Cracking the Cultural Ceiling and Cracking the Glass Cultural Ceiling. They're from the Diversity Council of Australia, and what we've touched on here, there's a ton of stuff in these reports, and they've taken a long time to develop. What they've identified are what they call locks that are locking people out of being able to deploy their international skill set, and what are the keys to actually unlocking that and seeing that go through. It's all backed up with research and data and so on, and I can't recommend them more. The Cracking the Cultural Ceiling, I think, is from 2014 or 15, and the Glass Cultural Ceiling, which is on women from non-Anglo backgrounds, shall we say, in the workplace, and how they're actually getting a sort of a double hit of prejudice, if we want to call it that, and it most certainly is. So both of them, I think, are really useful, because they're useful whether we're thinking of ourselves as an international talent, or we're thinking of ourselves as working in an environment where we might want to identify people who we want to work with, who might be being a bit quiet, or who might not be in the meeting talking about all the things that they could possibly bring to the table. But sort of finding ways to extract that, I think these two reports are really excellent. I'll send around a link if you like. It's not hard for me to do. But yeah, it's basically just two PDFs that are really readable. Most of it is infographic, so it's quite good. Maybe I'll post those on LinkedIn, and then we can have a further discussion about that if you want to take a look.
Yep.
if you have any other reports or things that you kind of like to reference, or even people that you follow that you think, man, this person really nails it, by all means share that too. I kind of a bit of a eager beaver with this stuff, and I always like to not currently aware of. Okie dokie. And then the last bit is these are just my contact details. Probably you've already got them. But my email address is there, and China X Oz is where to find Camp on the interwebs. Beijing Betty is me on Twitter. I don't really do much about China on Twitter. I generally just rant about the patriarchy, but that's fine. If you're into that, you can check that out. And my WeChat is Andrea Miles. So if you prefer to have a chat on WeChat, and I certainly love WeChat, then by all means add me. It'd be great to see you there. Okay, so I think we should wrap it up, guys. We have gone over time despite my best efforts, but there is a lot to discuss, and I really appreciate your time in spending it here, whether you lasted the full hour and 20 minutes or part thereof. Any final comments or questions before we wrap it up?
That was fantastic. Thanks. Yeah, thanks for inviting us, Andrea.
Yeah, no worries. Welcome.
Thank you, Andrea. Thanks for organizing that. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, no, listen, it's a pleasure. And obviously it's just the tip of an iceberg, isn't it? But I think by being connected and having, a little moment where we do get at least a approximate face-to-face experience, it certainly kicks things off in the right direction.
Yep.
Cool dudes. All right. Thank you so much for spending time. Really, really great to meet you. People who I have met face-to-face or have not met face-to-face before. And I will post this up on LinkedIn so we can actually, we can go back over it, or you can share it with somebody if you want to. Okay, guys. All right. Enjoy your dinner. I'll talk to you soon.
Okay.
Thanks.
Bye.
Thanks, guys.
See ya.
Bye.
Bye.